And this is how his entire theory falls apart right here. Welcome to History Legends, and in this video I'll do a step-by-step analysis as to how the Axis could have won World War II. Without further ado, don't forget to like this video, share to one friend, and subscribe. And don't worry guys, I'm not done my historical movie reviews. Next up is Hacksaw Ridge, but it's such a huge video I want to take special attention to it. You know I can't start a video without having my coffee. I'm geared up, let's go.
For the course of this video, we'll be looking at how, on a strategic level, the Axis could have won the Second World War and brought about a world dominated by totalitarian and militaristic regimes.
What's funny is that we didn't even need Germany to win World War II to have a bunch of authoritarian regimes all over the world.
We had a few ground rules for this video. I'm leaving most of the leadership intact for the Axis. The Germans could have been much more successful under a non-Nazi regime, but we won't
What is this BS?
Hitler.
Okay guys, okay, I have to start right away. What do you mean Germany would have fared better if they were non-Nazi? If they were not Nazis, they would not have waged total war. And for me, this argument falls completely apart because during World War I, the German monarchy did not fare much better.
We're going to open this timeline in 1940 during the invasion of France. There's no reason to really change the Japanese invasion of China or the German invasions of Poland and Scandinavia. Some people debate if it was worthwhile for the Germans to invade Norway and leave at any given time 300,000 troops there, but the fact of the matter is they needed it to secure their iron supplies from...
Okay, one thing that everybody skips is how Germany in the 1930s not only reoccupied the left side of the Rhine, rearmed itself without the French and the British intervening in order to prevent a new rise of Germany. The British and the French put great effort to build that wall with Czechoslovakia and Poland around Germany. The art of Germany is how they destroyed each of these nations individually without the French and the British to intervene. This is really the most skillful part of World War II, and it's not even technically considered part of World War II.
From Sweden. And if they didn't invade, the British would have. And the Germans would be there anyways. This would give the Germans the benefit of having Norway as a potential ally, but ultimately Hitler wanted to annex the country anyways, so that doesn't help with the long-term goals.
Okay, but this is not a Hearts of Iron game. I mean, okay, let's go, continue.
As such, the operation goes as it did in our timeline. The first crucial difference in this timeline is Dunkirk. Allowing 300,000 Allied soldiers to escape from the port let the British regroup and was a huge morale boost for the Allies. This just didn't need to happen. If Hitler allowed the armored divisions to move forward, they would have been able to kill and capture this entire force. This would be a huge blow to British morale and deprive them of what was left of the British Expeditionary Force.
Okay, no. The problem in this theory is that he doesn't even question as to why the German stops. It just says Hitler wanted to stop, he stopped, and then he could have destroyed the beachhead in Dunkirk. For a time, I actually believed that letting the British escape at Dunkirk was one of Germany's biggest mistakes. But we have to understand why the Germans even halted. There are many factors. I'm just going to name a few. For example, the French and British counterattacks on their flanks, which scared some generals. Then there's this overstretching of supply lines, right? The Panzer divisions were tired. There's another theory that claims that the German generals were taking hold of Hitler's military campaign and were giving orders without asking him first. And to reassert his dominance over the Wehrmacht, Hitler ordered a stop just for every German general to submit to him. And this is one of the biggest problems as a dictator. You want the army on your side. Without the support of the army, you lose no matter what. However, there's one more reason as to why the German panzers were halted, and it might be a complete coincidence, but there were channels of discussion between Lord Halifax, one of the key members of the war cabinet in London, and German officials, and they were trying to negotiate a peace, just like they were doing with the French. One man came in and stopped everything. Winston Churchill. He was one of the only ones that wanted to continue the war against Germany. Almost the entire parliament, the war cabinet, were ready to surrender, just like France. But one man stood up and said no. And this happened before Dunkirk. Churchill's hardest battle was to convince the war cabinet and the parliament to keep fighting no matter what. And he achieved that before the Dunkirk evacuation. That means that the British were ready to lose this army if it had to be. But you also can't forget that the British actually organized 3 evacuations from France. You have Operation Dynamo from Dunkirk, you have Operation Cycle from Normandy, and then Operation Ariel from Western France. You didn't know that, did you? And even if German panzer divisions had pressed on, one can argue that French troops would have halted them long enough, like they did at Lille or all over northern France, for the British to evacuate. The French would have sacrificed themselves.
Invasion of France would be Italian involvement. In 1938 and 39, while Hitler tried to start a war over Czechoslovakia and Poland, the Italians intervened to try and start peace conferences so they could avoid being dragged into a war they weren't ready for. By this time, Hitler was sick of the Italians attempting to interfere. If the Germans had been upfront about the invasion and encouraged Italian participation, Mussolini could have dealt a more serious blow. But this is doubtful. Hitler had no reason to view the Italians any differently between September 1939 and May 1940. The Italians in our timeline didn't even enter the war against the Allies until France was clearly losing and Paris had been captured. Italian troops didn't cross the border until they knew an armistice was being signed by the French. Mussolini knew he would eventually face a war against Britain and France to achieve his territorial ambitions, but he had serious reservations. It seems unlikely he would join the war until after the Germans took out the bulk of the Allied armies at Dunkirk, but that's still a month before they joined in our timeline. Assuming they do this,
what?
The forces in East
Oh
Africa
my god, this is so
will
bad!
probably land in Corsica.
No!
Beyond the Alps into France.
No! So the way he says that, oh, the Italians just go into France, this is pure fantasy. What is little known in history is that the French actually built a small Maginot Line on the border with Italy, a series of fortified bunkers and positions. For example, at Pont Saint-Louis, 9 men in a bunker stopped 3,000 Italians and only stopped fighting when the order of surrender was broadcasted. Italy going to war 1 month before would have been the biggest blessing for the Allies. That also means that the Italians attack Egypt early on. And we know how this went. Italy lost 150,000 killed, wounded and captured within a few days, against 36,000 British under General Wavell. But that also means that the French forces in North Africa can DP Libya with the British and completely kick out the axis of Africa, North Africa. That means no Africa Corps and no attack towards the Suez Canal. And if we push his theory further, that means that not only the Royal Navy but the French Navy as well can attack the Italians early on and possibly destroy the Navy right away. And that puts an end to any access claim to any land in the Mediterranean.
France. This might even hasten the French surrender by a few weeks. In our timeline, Italy was not present for the French surrender to the Germans, and they didn't get a seat at the negotiating
because they
table.
lost.
In this timeline, with more extensive involvement, Hitler allows Mussolini to attend. While this is a bit far-fetched, Hitler
yes,
goes up to Mussolini, going out of his way to save him from the Allies in 1943 in our timeline. So if the Italians actively participated in the Battle of France, I can see Mussolini getting back in Hitler's good graces. The peace would look much the same, except with Savoy and Nice being given to Italy, along with French Somalia being subsumed into Italian East Africa. The Italians would also push the French to hand over Tunisia and Corsica, but I doubt that would actually happen. The second major turning point is the Battle of Britain. I'm not about to make the case that the Germans could have or would have landed on the British Isles. Actually, the exact opposite. Hitler had little desire to invade Britain and hoped that by threatening to attack their homeland...
Okay, he wanted to take down Britain, but he couldn't. Little nuance.
They'd sue for peace. This attempt resulted in failure, while another, just as obvious and more efficient path was virtually ignored. Britain's strength at this time lay not in the British Isles, but in their massive empire. In this alternate timeline, the Germans worked with the Italians to dismantle the British positions in the Mediterranean. The British holdings around the Mediterranean were poorly...
Okay, maybe this holds some truth, I have to admit. So if you can't take down England right away, the United Kingdom right away, you can attack its empire. However, the problem is that Napoleon tried the same thing to blockade Britain as an island. And we saw how it failed with Napoleon, and this tactic also failed in World War II.
In this alternate timeline, the Germans worked with the Italians to dismantle the British positions in the Mediterranean. The British holdings around the Mediterranean were poorly equipped in 1940 to 1941, so a strong push by the Germans and Italians could have knocked them out of the region for good and dealt a serious blow to the empire as a whole. This could be achieved by the Germans landing in Malta in late 1940, using aircraft to bomb the island and drop paratroopers rather than attacking the British Isles. Meanwhile, the Italian...
The problem here is that we have to accept that France surrendered. We have to accept that the Royal Navy did not attack before. Yeah. And sure, it would have been a good idea for the Germans to attack Malta before. But like I said, if the Axis is pushed out of North Africa, what's the point?
Would push out from East Africa with their superior manpower and take British Somalia and Sudan. While in North Africa, supported by a few German divisions, the Italians could push across Egypt and seize the Suez Canal. If you think this is ridiculous, I don't think you understand.
Yes, I think this is ridiculous.
And the British or Italian strength at this time. In June 1940, the Italians had around 300,000 soldiers in East Africa, compared to the 18,000 British soldiers in Sudan and Kenya. In November, the British had bolstered this to about 98,000, compared to the 371,000 Italian troops. Well, Kenya would be different.
The Italian army in Ethiopia had no supplies, so time was against them. And 70% of this Italian army in Ethiopia was composed of locally recruited askari. And as we've seen in Libya, a small motorized force could destroy this army pretty quickly, and this is what actually happened.
Difficult to conquer due to their terrain. Sudan is mostly desert with only a flat river valley around the Nile to conquer. Hitler in our timeline only reluctantly sent a single panzer regiment in March 1941 to ensure the Italians
in Libya,
North Africa. This force then went on to almost conquer Egypt by 1942. Imagine if the Germans had sent an actual army to North Africa only a few months after the Battle of France.
Again, the Mediterranean front was really not the main focus of the German army in 1940-1941, and it's simple to understand why. Because the German attack in 1940 was a huge gamble. It required France and Britain to surrender through people, let's say, that were favorable to Nazi Germany. But that did not happen. We call it this a military victory, but it is a political disaster. And if that wasn't enough, now Stalin was looking at Germany, and the Germans knew that if they didn't pay attention to their eastern front, everything would collapse. So sending a few divisions in Africa was the least of their concern.
If they were this invested in taking North Africa, it's doubtful Rommel would have even gotten the command there, with someone like Guderian a more likely candidate. In this timeline, the Axis steamrolled the eastern Mediterranean, taking Malta, Egypt, Transjordan, and Cyprus, while a friendly regime would be set up in Iraq under Rashid Ali, which would conquer Kuwait, removing the British from the Middle East. This would have...
So he makes a huge thing for this Iraqi uprising when the campaign lasted 10 days. Now the British Indian Army could have intervened a lot in the Middle East if it was necessary, just like it did in World War I. And if the British really needed additional manpower and they were really desperate, they could have brought in troops from their East African colonies, which they did not do much, but they could have.
This would have massive effects on the war going forward. First off, it's possible that with such serious losses, the British would give up right here. The Suez was vital to the maintenance of the British Empire, and its capture would have serious ramifications. On top of that, the Axis now have access to the oil reserves they need to continue the war indefinitely, while the British have lost most of their oil reserves. This also put the Germans just south of the Caucasus, nearly encircling European Russia. And I can see the Germans negotiating with Iran on allowing them to cross their territory for the future.
Okay, I can't anymore. This guy's trolling. It cannot be serious. Again, the problem is that he completely ignores the fact that the Soviets had 3 armies at the border with Persia, ready to invade if necessary. And they did so in the summer of 1941, in a joint operation with the British forces where they basically split up Persia. And this secured not only oil for the Allies, but also a direct supply line to the Soviet Union.
Invasion of the Soviet Union. This fact wouldn't be lost on the Russians, who would try and see how hostile the Germans were feeling at this point. They might even send overtures to the British, trying to give them the hope that the Russians would join their side and invade Germany, while negotiating a continued peace with the Germans behind their backs. The Russians, meanwhile, would still get invaded in the summer of 1941. Stalin did everything he could in our timeline not to piss off the Germans, giving them all the resources detailed in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
We can't forget that the Soviets attacked Finland, they attacked the Baltic state, they attacked Bessarabia, so they were not in a peaceful situation. And this is what I don't like in this series, is that when the German panzer divisions are all steaming through the Middle East, that means the German Eastern Front is completely open for Soviet invasion. He put a lot of effort in this video, but there's no historical foundation in what he's saying. He doesn't back up anything of what he says with actual historical facts or anything. Notice how when he invades countries, he never names how many troops. He just says, oh, it falls in a month. Okay, why month? Why not 2 weeks? 3 weeks? Never mentions how many troops are sent, and never mentions what the Allies are doing in the meantime when the Germans are attacking here left and right. The Allies stay passive. And this is the biggest criticism I have for his theory, is that for every action he gives the Axis, there must be a response from the Allies, and there's none here. So what did you think of this video? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and tell me which video you want me to cover next. With that being said, if you want to have real first-hand accounts of World War II, check out my book, link in the bio.